Hello and welcome to another episode of Parliamentary Conversations in the Commonwealth, the CPA podcast focusing on some of the most critical issues for parliamentarians across the world. We have a very special guest joining us today for a conversation about democratic transitions. Our guest is His Excellency Danny Faure, the former President of the Republic of Seychelles. President Faure served as the fourth President of Seychelles from October 2016 until October 2020, during which time he notably presided over the first democratic transfer of power between opposing political parties in Seychelles' history in 2020. Since leaving office, he has remained an active figure on the global stage, particularly in promoting democratic governance and Commonwealth values. President Faure has chaired Commonwealth election observer missions in countries such as Sri Lanka in 2024 and Gabon in 2025, lending his experience and leadership to help monitor and uphold democratic processes. In these roles, he led teams of observers to assess the fairness and credibility of elections and to support those countries' commitment to democracy. President Faure, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Oz.
I wanted to start out, first of all, by asking how you got involved in these election observation missions and what exactly being a chair of one of these missions entails.
Yes, for me, it has been an honor for me to be invited by the Secretary General of the Commonwealth to lead Commonwealth election observer missions. And I have covered five countries already, and this being Lesotho, that was my first country in the southern part of Africa. And the second one was in the Caribbean, Antigua and Barbuda, that has a similar population size like Seychelles. And then I went to the Maldives, Sri Lanka, and of course, lately I was in Gabon. So I've been selected by the Secretary General in my personal capacity, and of course, in this team, I'm joined with other personalities based on their areas of expertise and experience. These ranging from politics, constitutional law, expert in civil society, in the media. So we have a range of people, and of course experts in the election, the functioning of election, the organization of election itself.
So, you yourself are a former head of government and a head of state, and you spoke to the wide experience of people on these missions. But why specifically do you think it's important for a former head of government or a head of state, in many cases, to be leading these missions?
I would say most of these missions are led by former president or a former prime minister, and in some cases I've noticed there also have been cases of former foreign affairs ministers leading. But most of the time, as you have rightly pointed out, these missions are led by former heads of state. So in my role as a former head of state and head of government, I bring on the table the experience, and of course, I get to meet the different stakeholders in the election process, and I get to meet political leaders. I get to meet the incumbent, and most of the time, the incumbent is either a prime minister or a sitting president, and I need to hold dialogue with these personalities, and for the Commonwealth, I think it's very, very important that the level of protocol in the work that we do gives more importance to the work of the Commonwealth, and finally to the assessment that is being made by the team on the ground. And if at any one point there is a need for the leader of the observer mission, and in this case, as a former president, I can also act in the role of, as we say in the Commonwealth, the office of the Commonwealth, meaning I can speak on behalf of the Secretary General on issues that are not necessarily linked to the election cycle, but other issues that the Secretary General would like me to pass on as a message, or in some cases, of course, I would also bring messages on behalf of the Secretary General on a specific case linked to the election. But most of the time, in my experience of the five elections, I've played the role of a leader, leading a very good, eminent team representing the Commonwealth of Nations.
And one time you did have to intervene was during the elections in Sri Lanka, where there was an unprecedented situation of a second round of counting under Sri Lanka's preferential voting system for their presidential elections. You had called for patience and calm as the process entered this extended counting phase. What kind of experience did you bring from this in managing some of the tensions or fraught issues that might arise during a democratic transition of power?
No, the election, the experience of Sri Lanka, I would say, is it was an experience in itself. And as you said, they've got a preferential system, and there has been there was a lot of expectation within Sri Lanka, and our role is to ensure that the climate is one which remains peaceful. Ultimately, what we want to achieve is the will of the people is carried out in a peaceful manner, and you can have noises from different quarters, but we just need to put our eyes on getting the will of the people, the expression of the will of the people, the counting that takes place, to follow all the procedures in place as agreed by all parties. So it's important, very important, that we bring down the tempo and everybody is quiet, and we wait for the final outcome. So my role there was to tell, let us remain patient, let the process continue, and we wait for the results. And I think we managed to achieve that. And all in all, it was a peaceful election in Sri Lanka.
And in terms of kind of regulating this tempo or maintaining calm during an election process, especially with consideration to recent history, how important is the role of outgoing leaders in accepting election results for facilitating a smooth handover of power?
Well, I think for I would say in the case of Sri Lanka, I had the opportunity for me to meet with the incumbent, meaning the sitting president. And one of the issues that was discussed was essentially that we conveyed the message that the election should take place in a very conducive environment, and at all costs we need to preserve peace. At the end of the day, it's the will of the people, and there was a great understanding that all necessary steps were taken in place to ensure that on his part this would be done. And we had also spoken to all political parties, and I had also met with the police, senior management of the police force in Sri Lanka. So it is important that this message is passed on prior to the election. It's not only on election day, but the message needs to go forward. So from my experience as a former president, that I have also had gone through the transfer of power, I have seen, and I also have felt the impact that an election has on a sitting president. But what is very important is to respect the will of the people. So for me, respecting the will of the people is extremely important. Uh, People have the right to vote. It's their right to vote. And it's the right of everyone to respect the outcome of the elections. So as a leader, this is the type of role that I play in my interaction, in my conversation, in my dialogue with all stakeholders, bringing that message home.
That's quite a critical part of this process. I think it's interesting that you mentioned meeting with the police beforehand as well, and also talking about different stakeholders. How important would you say institutions are in maintaining democracy or ensuring a smooth transfer of power, and what other institutions do you usually speak to during these observation missions, or even in your own experience before the elections in the Seychelles?
Now, I would say, to summarize the experience that I've had covering the 5 countries, uh, you need to lead the group. So I can now talk on behalf of the group that I've managed to lead in the 5 countries with different groups, but people drawn from the same areas of based on the expertise and experience. Uh, we we meet with all stakeholders, but in terms of institution, the police is key. Okay,
Mhm.
so we need to meet with the police, and when I say with the police, we we meet with the senior management of the police, including the commission of the police. Okay, so it's important that we understand uh, the level of preparedness, uh, and how are they going to deploy the force, whether there are any pockets, as we say, black areas that they need to concentrate, uh, how they manage these areas, what is the relationship that they have uh, pre-election with the election management bodies in these countries. So this
Mhm.
brings me to the second institution. And the second institution is the election management body, which there should not be any interference. It has under the laws and constitution, it has a mandate to manage the election and to ensure that the election process is uh, is governed by, I would say, robust rules and regulations, so that it is clear to everybody, the participants and the voters. We also meet with the Attorney General. We also have meetings with the judiciary. And in Gabon, we had the opportunity for us to meet with the nine judges, I would say, that hold a very important role in once the election is announced. So basically, by law, they will be the body that will finally say this is the result. So it's very important. So the institutions are very, very important. We also meet with the broadcasting corporation, whether it's public or private, their associations. We meet with the media, the journalists in these countries. We meet with several NGOs dealing with election. In some countries, we call that minority groups. So we also get to meet with them, the women's organizations, people with disability. So we get to meet with a lot of stakeholders, but we spend time with institutions. It's important that we continue, and this I would say it's the work that the Commonwealth needs to continue to do, to work with this institution, to build capacity of this institution, because each country has its own historical and political background and levels of development and levels of democracy. So it's important to continue to journey with the countries while building and consolidating further the democratic institution of our countries within the Commonwealth. So I would say that institutions are very, 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 very important to ensure that democracy continues to prevail in our respective countries.
I was struck quite a bit by what you were saying there about different kind of historic and political contexts and institutions within these countries as well, and also just by the breadth of the countries that you've observed these missions in, from the Caribbean to Africa to Asia. Are there any kind of unique logistical issues that you've faced in any of these missions or in trying to meet with all of the relevant stakeholders?
Out of the 5 countries, what we need to continue to look at now, it's the role of the social media, how social media impacts uh, the election cycle, and how social media is being used. And these are challenges. And the key thing tomorrow is, with artificial intelligence, you would want your leader to be a real leader that talks to you, that brings the narrative forward, so that there is discussion on the manifesto,
Yep.
on the policies. Uh, you would not want to be talking to somebody or a tool that knows nothing about politics, but can influence the way you think and the way you will decide. So this is a huge challenge for our countries. But I would say each of the 5 countries, the way they organize the election, there is similarity, but we need to build on this similarity. We need to consolidate them further. And one area that I think is important is how far does money influence election? Uh, are we going to have a system where you can have a system where you cap
Right.
uh, that prevents political leaders from abusing the system? And if you do have a system of campaign financing in a country, at what point do you monitor? Do you monitor after, or you have a system in place that you can also monitor before? Going back to social media, uh, we have seen political parties paying for adverts. Uh, some countries, these adverts are not paid internally. It's paid by somebody who has nothing to do with the country, but pays the advert. So all these are challenges for our respective countries. But what is important, the election commissions, the election management bodies need to continue to work on the type of rules, regulation, and laws, and that these should be fair to everybody, to all the players.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a kind of useful understanding of this and some of these
Yeah,
issues that are coming up again and again when we speak to different parliamentarians. Um, I think it's kind
yeah,
of interesting to think of elections in the longer term in this way as well, and institutions being built up or regulations being set before the elections. And you had mentioned earlier
Yes.
that in your capacity representing the Commonwealth, that often it's incumbent on you to uh, try and discuss these Commonwealth values when you are on these missions. Could you speak a bit to what you kind of think the main guiding lights should be for the Commonwealth and what the kind of best means of achieving the goals set out in the Commonwealth Charter would be?
Well, I think basically uh, all members of the Commonwealth, we have agreed to the Commonwealth Charter. And in terms of elections, it's a question of the rights of the citizens. So the right of the citizen to elect whoever they wish to elect, uh, the right of the citizen to be respected when you say, I am going to choose so and so, you need to respect my views. There has to be freedom of all political parties for them to be able to do their campaign. And there has to be also fairness and equity in terms of airtime given to all parties. If you are incumbent, you cannot just only get 1 hour, and then if you are not, if you're not in government, you will get 30 minutes. So, because you are participating in the election, there has to be the same level playing field, and there has to be equity in whatever you do. And so, basically, the Commonwealth believes that these values needs to be, we need to uphold these values, uh, irrespective whether it's a small island state, whether it's a highly developed Commonwealth country. But because we are members of the Commonwealth, it's important that we keep these values, whereby people have the right to choose their leaders to govern, and they have to they have to participate in an election process which is credible, which the laws are fair, and there is equity in the provision of funding to whatever is being given to all political parties
I think
where
the
elections are
corollary to
concerned.
those would be this idea of democratic backsliding. It's something, unfortunately, we've seen a lot more of in the world today over the past decade and a half or so. In your view, what are the biggest risks or warning signs for this kind of democratic backsliding? And what can just everyday citizens or leaders within countries to try and halt this process or even reverse it?
Now, I think what is very important is we need to keep, we need to respect institutions. Early on, I said within the Commonwealth, we need to continue to help one another to build institutions. But once you build institutions and you are elected in office, you cannot use these institutions for your own survival. That is not democratic. Okay? In a democracy, institutions are there, and the institutions have to remain independent. Independent, apolitical, and there cannot be interference by the ruling party. Okay? The moment you see that there is influence, interference, the moment you see that there are signs of undermining institution, then we say that there is a backsliding of democracy in these countries. So the red flag is interference. in these
Right.
institutions, lack of funding towards these institutions by the budget, by controlling budget in parliament. When you do not provide funds to the institutions, what you do, you weaken these institutions. So these institutions have to remain independent. Independent so that they continue to do their work within the constitutional and legal framework of each country. So keep its independence and get the politicians out of these institutions. And these will really help the democratic process of the country. The other thing that we need to look out, the relationship between government with the media. It's very important that the media continues to play its role, that the media themselves, the journalists, they continue to upgrade the work that they do, but we need to give them the space for them to do their work. We in government should not close the door for journalists to have access to what government is doing, because the role of the journalists is to get information so that they can speak truth to what is being done, what is being said in society. And the role of journalists is also to bring the narrative forward. The role of journalists is also to create the space so that there's this political debate, thinking in the community, in society, and all this is healthy. So the moment you see that journalists are restricted, this is a sign that something is not healthy. So we just need to keep away, let journalists do their work for in the interest of furthering the values of democracy.
Okay. President Faure, thank you very much for joining me on the CPA's podcast.
Well, it has been an honor for me to talk to you, Oz, and I hope I've been able to shed light on the work that we are doing in the Commonwealth family. So I wish you all the very best.
Our first conversation with Danny Faure looked at the practical elements of elections and democracy, be that through the role of institutions like the police, election observation missions, or the role of incumbents in giving up power after an election defeat. Our second conversation looks at what protects and enables democracy in the long run, and particularly how different forms of nationalism can either enable or hinder a democratic transition. Our guest today is Professor Maya Tudor, Professor of Politics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and Fellow at St Hilda's College at the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on the origins of effective and democratic states, with a particular focus on South Asia. She is the author of over 20 peer-reviewed articles and 2 books, The Promise of Power, The Origins of Democracy in India and Autocracy in Pakistan, and Varieties of Nationalism. Professor Tudor, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start off, first of all, to talk about democracy. It's quite a contested concept. So I'm wondering what kind of perspective you would bring in terms of trying to get towards a definition of democracy, either for your work or study generally.
Well, it's an important question because before you talk about democratic backsliding or any kind of changes in democracy, you have to be really clear about what democracy is. And many people have an intuitive understanding of what democracy is. They think of democracy as ruled by the people and of the people, for the people. But what does that exactly mean? And how do you go about thinking, measuring whether a country falls in what category? So I like to think of it as, democracy is a little bit like a multifaceted diamond. So their kind of central facet to it is, of course, elections. Right? Everybody knows that elections are the kind of if you don't have elections, you're definitely not a democracy. So, North Korea is a country that doesn't have elections, and so it's not a democracy. But in point of fact, having elections isn't enough because, as we know, there are many, many countries, even most countries in the world today, have elections. China has elections. It's just not for the chief executive. Russia has elections, right? So there are other aspects, in particular four, I would say, that one really needs to add to combine to create this multifaceted idea of democracy. So a second is civil liberties. And by that I mean the right of individuals to go out to the street and say, well, I disagree with the government, to get together to protest peacefully, to write up their protests or their disagreement with the government in newspapers and not be targeted for that. That's really important to emphasize because lots of countries in the world today have elections and democratic backsliding or decline is happening in the form of not declining elections or not military tanks rolling through the streets, but instead because we're having people who are elected to power then slowly diminish kind of civil liberties. So a third facet is also the right of political competition to effectively organize. So there are countries in which you have pretty robust protections of civil liberties and you have elections, but the government and the dominant political party makes it very hard for the opposition to organize. A canonical case on this is Singapore, which is not widely considered a democracy because the governing party, the PAP, makes it very difficult for opposition parties to actually function effectively. They do things like redraw the district boundaries right before the election, or they make opposition parties run in teams. Things like that mean that the playing field is actually not even, but in fact heavily tilted towards the incumbent. And another aspect that's also really important is, of course, the absence of an unelected veto. So that might be, historically in the 20th century, the two major ways in which you've seen an unelected veto function in countries is either through colonialism. So there was you had elections within the regime, but the real strings of power were not pulled at the national level, but elsewhere. And a second form, which you continue to see today, is militaries in power. So Pakistan is an example of a country where even though you have elections and you have civil liberties and you have all those other facets of democracy, it's the military that's actually, through a variety of mechanisms behind the scenes, pulling the strings of power. And so all of these things together make up democracy. And that's really important because we're all really clear on what is a democracy. If you see all of those dimensions represented in full force. And we're all pretty clear when you don't have elections or any of those that it's not a democracy. But how do you think about countries where, as has been the case in every corner of the world in the last decade, somebody comes to power promising to represent a we the people in some shape or form, and then chipping away at various aspects of those facets? When do you say, all right, this has slid to such a degree that one is actually now in the region of authoritarianism? And that requires some judgment. So broadly speaking, there's kind of, democratic regimes, there's autocratic regimes, and there is a large and growing area of what political scientists call hybrid regimes.
I think that brings me on well to my next question then. Considering these facets, there's quite a few these composite measures of democracy out there from the likes of, say, Freedom House, The Economist. How useful would you say these are in understanding democracy, either from a policy perspective or from a scholarly perspective as well?
It's a great question. All of these indices, there's also varieties of democracy, have their pros and their cons, but they together will often tell you the trend in a country. So let's take Freedom House, for example. Freedom House essentially gives each country every year a report card, and it's based out of 100 points. And 60 of those points are given for things associated with civil liberties and those other facets that I talked about, but not elections. And then 40 points are given for things associated with elections. And the threshold for being a democracy is 70. So if you just do the maths there, it's quite clear that you can't actually get to 70 unless you have substantial guarantees of not only things like fair elections, but also the rights that make those electoral moments meaningful. So each of those scorecards is a snapshot, and taken together, they're really helpful for understanding what is happening globally in politics, because oftentimes you're seeing that countries are learning from each other. Both autocrats and democrats are looking around the world and learning from each other in terms of how they can both come to power and stay in power.
In contrast to this kind of glut of forms of measurements of democracy, you've written before about how nationalism has kind of failed to come to a shared definition across different academic fields, and then even within academic fields as well. Why is there such a disparity, and why has this been so long in coming?
It's another good question. It has a couple of answers. The first answer has to do with what nationalism means in the everyday imagination of most people. So especially in Europe, but also in many other places, nationalism is associated with the horrors of the 20th century and the wars that were fought in the name of the nation. So there was a sense after World War II that nationalism was something to be abhorred. Famously, Einstein called nationalism the measles of mankind. And there wasn't a really robust research agenda into nationalism, partly for that reason. Of course, that was a mistake, because we need to understand how something works and how history works if we want to avoid repeating it. But another reason is that nationalism as a kind of idea is split across lots of fields of study. So social psychologists study the kind of psychological foundations of what it means to belong to the national community. Political scientists study how belonging to a national community does things like lead to war or other kinds of outcomes. Sociologists study it across time, and so do historians. So unlike, let's say, utilitarianism, which is really squarely owned by philosophers, or things like democracy, which are owned by political scientists, it's an idea that's split across a lot of academic disciplines, and that's meant that scholars haven't always talked to each other about what the nation is and how it works in societies.
I guess it's maybe a problem of self-definition as well, and that a lot of these movements might not want to associate themselves with kind of universal ideology per se.
Yes, indeed.
But you've written a book recently that goes towards kind of defining 5 different varieties of nationalism. Could you outline those briefly and say how you came to these?
So I got to, with my co-author, Harris Milunas, we began by really asking the question, okay, so what is nationalism and what have scholars said about it? And as we began to look, we realized that it was a hot mess of discussions and definitions. So we said, if we're confused and we're in this field, probably so are others. So we began to look and did a lot of research into how different scholars understood and studied nationalism, and the book really grew out of that. So the 5 dimensions of nationalism are popular and elite fragmentation or cohesion, ascriptiveness, thickness, and salience. And I'll take those in turn. So when elites define a nation, they can be relatively cohesive, or they can have different ideas of what defines the nation. So an example I give in the book is, India had both Hindu nationalists as well as Nehruvian nationalists, followers of the first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and Gandhian nationalists. And they had different ideas of what it meant to belong to the Indian nation. So they were cohesive in some respects, but they were also somewhat fragmented with respect to what exactly it meant to belong to the Indian nation. That same thing can be true in kind of everyday, popular imagination. So there has been research done, for example, in the United States, which shows that there are some people who hold more creedal understandings of what it means to be American, and that might be, you work hard, the Horatio Alger story, a nation of immigrants, and so forth. And then there's another aspect or definition of Americanness that has always centered around the kind of black and non-black or white conception of belonging. And different people hold different views of that. And so everyday people are also somewhat fragmented in the United States on what it means to belong. One can say the same thing of the United Kingdom. So, it's composed of 4 nations, and it's not surprising to me that Scots think of themselves as less British than the English do. Actually, was speaking not long ago to a member of Parliament who said to me, well, there is no such thing as Britishness. We just have 4 nations, and then Britishness really stands in for Englishness. And, so what it means to belong and who gets to define it can be fragmented or cohesive among both elites and the popular imagination. So the third dimension is ascriptiveness. Classically, scholars have talked about civic versus ethnic identities, but we call this dimension ascriptiveness, and what that really means is how fixed or socially attributed is the definition of the nation. So in Malaysia, for example, to be fully Malay, one has to be a member of the Bumiputra, which is actually an ethnic group. And so really the Malaysian nation is highly ascriptive, so it's socially fixed. There's not a lot of moving between who is Malay or Bumiputra and who's not, at least within a generation. And that differs across nationalisms. The fourth dimension is thickness, and you can think of this as sort of how many markers of belonging are there. There's geography in most cases. Is there a single language? So what does it mean to be a Sri Lankan? Well, does it mean that you speak a certain language? Actually, no, because there are 2 major languages that are spoken there. But there's a geographical definition, there's sort of understandings of certain readings of history, and the thicker that is, often the more cohesive the nation is. And the final dimension is salience, and that is really how top of mind is your national identity. So one thing I do when I teach here at the Blavatnik School, it's an incredibly international school, and when I ask my students, what is your most important identity? You have lots of identities as members of communities, as students, as maybe you have gender identities and so on. And in the context of a very international environment, one's national identity is often very salient. So most of them will say, well over half, in the context of being confronted with lots of people from other nations, my most salient identity is my nation. And we know that changes even within a country over time. So in times of war, the salience of your national identity relative to your local identity or your family identity rises. So that can change across time. So those 5 dimensions are really, we say in the book, are like different parts of the proverbial elephant, but they're all part of this thing that we call nationalism.
So taking these kind of 5 different aspects together then and looking at their relationship to democracy, I believe you've claimed that an inclusive nationalism has a strengthening effect on democracy within a state. What kind of aspects goes into creating an inclusive nationalism then, in a sense?
Yeah, so it's primarily the ascriptive sense of the nation. So all nations, to be clear, draw boundaries between who's in and who's out. And so non-citizens typically don't have the same rights and aren't part of the community of the people. Those three words are found in most constitutions around the world, right? In the preamble. So it's in the name of we the people, we are setting out these rules that are the rules that we will govern ourselves through. So that we the people is in many ways or has been differentially defined with respect to, in some cases, just ideas. So we mentioned earlier the American idea, but also Indonesia, India. These are countries that at their founding articulated ideas of what it meant to belong to the nation that did not center a religious identity, they didn't center an ethnic identity. And that's really important for democracy for the following reason. All the time in democracy, political entrepreneurs are testing, how can I come to power, right? How can I govern? How can I be elected by definition? So when they're doing that, and there is historical legitimation for othering a group of citizens, so the non-Bumiputra in Malaysia or non-Muslims in Pakistan, then those are groups that in times of crisis, but even in regular times, those political entrepreneurs can other those groups and often come to power on the basis that they're the problem. And that's a very, very old trick in politics, right? It's not focusing on the bread and butter issues of how do we get our education system to work better or how do we get our healthcare system to work better, but it's the minorities or the immigrants that are the problem. That it's particular that internal othering of minorities that nationalism can help to legitimate. So when you create definitionally second-class citizens at the founding of a country, you essentially create the ideational raw material for political entrepreneurs to take away or arrogate those rights in times of crises.
I think it's interesting to talk about the kind of moment of foundation as well. How sticky would these concepts of nationalism be? Like, is there scope for, say, political parties or governing parties these days to be able to fundamentally change the basis of that nationalism, or is it something that's quite fixed?
It's a great question. It's a very important question for our time, I think, because absolutely nations are at once backward looking, because to say who we are, we must look back and to say who we were. And so there's, in a sense, the idea of the we is backward looking. And that means it's in some sense sticky. But absolutely it can be redefined. And we're seeing that today and over the past decade in India. It's a great example. You had for really 3 to 6 decades, depending on, if you're counting coalition governments in India, you had an idea of the nation that really didn't center any religion. And then you had in 2014 an individual come to power who combined ideas of belonging to the dominant religion with a kind of developmentalist agenda. So both appealing to a relatively small group of very committed religious majoritarians with people who wanted to see development. And together, those bases of support drove Narendra Modi to power, brought him to power. And he has quite progressively, through time, through the last decade in power, redefined what it means to be Indian, sometimes in quite subtle ways. So, historically, before elections, Indian prime ministers or would-be prime ministers would, go to various religious communities, and, they would dress in the garb of those communities, and just sending the message that you too, even though you're a religious minority, you too are part of us. And that was not really done by Modi. There was, the appearing in orange, the saffron orange, which is the color of Hindu nationalism. There was a very prominent visits to Hindu temples, and primarily Hindu temples. There were things like educational curriculum. So if you think about, if your listeners ask themselves, where did they learn about what it meant to be a member of their nation? Chances are you learned about it in school. You learned about it in history or in civics. And the content of what is taught, who are the key figures and what do they represent, that's taught in schools. And so there's been a really important but quite determined change in how the prominence of Hindu figures in defining the Indian nation. So it's a long way of really answering your question and saying, absolutely, nations are sticky, but they're also living. And that means they're continually redefined and layered by progressive generations.
You had mentioned earlier as well, creating a distinction between, say, an idea of European nationalism that's overwhelmingly defined by World War II, say, versus nationalism generally. Given your kind of area of study of South Asia, is there anything distinctive about this post-colonial wave of independence after World War II, or the experience of British colonialism, that might have affected which varieties of nationalism or democracy came about?
So I think those are two distinct questions. So I'm going to take them in turn. The European experience with nationalism is in important ways different from most of the world. Really, it's Europe that's the outlier, and the rest of the world, right, in terms of sheer numbers and in terms of countries, Europe is in the minority. And in Europe, state building often happened over many, many centuries even. And that meant that you got different kinds of much more capacious states emerging. So there's a famous argument in political science by Charles Tilly that war made the state and the state made war. And basically the idea there is that states that were weak were conquered by states that were strong. So over a kind of Darwinian process of natural selection, you get strong states emerging in Europe. States in the rest of the world typically have emerged through the experience of colonialism. So often you had some kind of quasi-imperial princely state, some kind of form of that was not really the modern nation state. And then you get colonialism and a reaction to colonialism that primarily and quite typically grows out of the groups of indigenous elites that are attending often colonial education institutions. And those groups say, well, wait a minute, we could run the state without having the colonial regime there. And then they articulate a nationalist movement. So state making and nation making are very closely intertwined in most of the world, whereas they're really separated in Europe. Mostly you get states emerging before you get nations. There are exceptions in Europe. Germany is a case of a country where you really had an idea of a nation before you had the state emerging under Bismarck in the 1870s.
Then I think in terms of the experience of South Asia as well, what's the role of institutions and this common experience with, say, British colonialism and then a lot of these, say, Westminster parliamentary models coming in after independence as well?
So the British colonialism has all else being equal, and that's a really important proviso. All else being equal, having had elections before independence, tended to entrench, embed systems of competition and systems of competing, normalizing systems of competing through elections. So there is an effect often when you look, broadly speaking, at democracy is kind of the outcome, you run statistical tests, you see a positive association with British colonialism because British colonialism was more likely than, say, French or Dutch colonialism to introduce elections before independence. Now, that being said, I want to be careful here. This does not mean that British colonialism was on the whole a good for these countries. So there are scholars like Atul Kohli at Princeton University who've actually done really exhaustive studies of the role that imperialism and colonialism play in economic development. And essentially his argument is the more you were colonized, the less good it was for your economy and the less good it was for your politics. And that's because, of course, colonial regimes often did things like take certain ethnic groups and give them privileged access to power. And that meant when you transitioned to fully independent politics and sometimes democracies, the kinds of loss aversion was in place often for these smaller groups. So that was true of Muslims in India. It was true of the Tamils in Sri Lanka. It was true of the Tutsis in Rwanda. So colonialism also had a variety of really negative legacies in terms of formalizing groups and often setting them against one another in a kind of a scramble to access power. But overall, there is still, comparatively speaking, between British and the other forms of colonialism, a positive effect in terms of democracy.
And then in terms of this idea of inclusive nationalism as well, is this a necessary precondition for democracy, or would you say it's just a strengthening factor amongst others?
So I'd step back to say that every functioning state needs a strong sense of nationalism. And what I mean by nationalism is not a sense that my nation is better than your nation, but a sense that there is something that holds us as members of a nation together. And when countries do not have that, if you think about the countries that don't have an effective, cohesive sense of what it means to belong to the nation, those are countries like Yemen, like Ethiopia, countries that really struggle to provide the basics of functioning states. So a first layer answer to that question is every effective state, whether democratic or not, needs a sense of what does it mean to belong, and that is nationalism. All else being equal, it is something I've argued and something I'm going to be arguing in my current book that when elites come to power at these kind of founding moments, and for often quite local, historically specific and contingent reasons, design a more inclusive, and of course by that I mean less ascriptive, less socially fixed idea of the nation, then those countries are less prone to the kinds of minority othering that one sees in states that have more ascriptive and therefore less inclusive kinds of national identity. I think an important thing to say here is that every government and every system often calls upon ideas of we the people to legitimate the use of state power. So in the United Kingdom, when leaders went to war or when they ask individuals to undertake some kind of sacrifice, pay higher taxes to contribute to the NHS, they call on ideas of what does it mean to be British, or what does it mean to be, whatever the national identity is. So I think of nationalism like a little bit like a battery that powers elites when they want to use state power. But they're not all the same kind of battery, and they differ in shape and size. And the claim I'm making in my forthcoming book is that the shape and size of that battery matters, and in particularly more ascriptive national identities tend, all else being equal, to undermine democracy.
Finally, I just wanted to ask you about this idea of democratic deficit. No matter what measure you use, it's quite clear that democracy is in retreat across vast swathes of the world. Is this, in your opinion, one singular process that's happening worldwide? And to use the analogy of the diamond, is there any one facet of democracy that countries are tending to fall down on?
So the civil liberties facet is by far the domain in which we're seeing the greatest retrenchment. It's not a retrenchment in elections that we're seeing at this moment in history. What we are seeing is a retrenchment of the rights of individuals to speak out against governments that have come to power. Particularly, of course, we've seen the rise of populist leaders. And what I mean by that are leaders that say, I represent the people, and the people are pure, and there's an elite that is corrupt, and that I as your leader, if you elect me, I will come to power and I will be your representative. And there's research that shows that leaders who, or aspiring leaders who use populist language, are much more likely to undermine democracy in some way when they come to power. I think that there is something particular, though, in this moment, in the sense that we're not only seeing kind of populism on the rise, we're not only seeing populism use nationalist language on the rise, but there is a sense, to my mind, that there is a sense that elites around the globe have pulled away a little bit from the common person. And this is true in many, many countries. And it's actually been true for long periods of time. I mean, if you think about the nobility in Tolstoy's Russia, they spoke French, right? They spoke a different language, they traveled differently. So that in a sense, this is not new. But nationalism and a world defined by nation states, that's relatively new. And many of the states that we see on the neat, global map with these very neatly defined boundaries, many of those states were created only in the last 150 years, almost most of them. And so the ideas that elites are pulling away from the people um, is, I think, part of what's different today. Mass media, and of course, particularly social media, is something that's quite different. But one has to, I think, be careful to think about what is it about social media that is mattering here. And I think it's the following. Social media is algorithmically driven to put us into like-minded communities. And it drives us also to kind of more extreme content in whatever form of extreme, left, right, in both directions. And that means that kind of our ability to speak to people who are different and just to have the encounter with somebody who is different from us is vanishingly small in frequency. It's also true because we're much more likely these days, most people are more likely to partner with somebody of the same educational level. Our physical communities that we live in, neighborhoods, are more homogenous. So there's a kind of drive in lots of facets of life towards homogeneity. And the core of democracy is being able to discuss and debate ideas and decide if the government is doing the right thing. And that means we have to preserve the right to disagree with government. But of course, people are elected on these ideas of the nation, and then they represent the nation and they represent the people. And it often behooves them to kind of manufacture boogeymen to stay in power. And that, I think, is something that is new in our time.
Professor Maya Tudor, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Parliamentary Conversations in the Commonwealth, the CPA's podcast. This episode was hosted by Oz Russell, Communications Officer at the CPA, and research was done by Oz Russell and James Pinnell, Programs Manager at the CPA. You can find our podcasts on a monthly basis on any of your favorite podcasting apps. For more information about the CPA and its work, please go to cpahq.org.